Okay, so we're only doing the Dean's Forum on the first Sunday of the month instead of virtually every week when there's not school holidays. Part of the reason for that is that it will let me get out to Lawrence and Cotmanhurst more often, and also because it's a lot of work to do one of these virtually every week on top of everything else. So I thought, okay, we did it that way last year, we got started, now let's knock it back and do it maybe once a month. So next time around, the Dean's Forum is actually going to be presented by John Shearer, and it's going to be a session on mindfulness for Christians. And later in the year, we're getting to do one for parents of baptism families, which will be mindfulness for busy parents or something like that. So it'll be more a talk about and some practice in the skills of meditation. The following month, it's probably me again, and we'll be doing an introduction to Holy Week, which are only a week or so away at that point, because it's the Sunday before Palm Sunday. And the first weekend in May, I haven't worked out what to do, but anyway, that's the plan for the first 2 or 3 months. So today we're looking at the Gospel of Luke as the lectionary gospel for this year. I'll talk about that in just a moment. Then next month it'll be John Shearer talking about and doing some work with us on mindfulness practices. The month after that we'll be doing a kind of getting ready for Holy Week and Easter kind of workshop. If there are other topics that you'd really like us to explore in one of these forums, please let us know, let Camilla or myself know, and we'll work out the best way to do that in one of these topics. The other thing that's happening is I wasn't able to get Bishop Murray for the Sunday in April, but he is going to be with us during Holy Week, Good Friday, Easter Eve and Easter Day. It's good being local. And so apart from what he's going to be preaching on Good Friday and probably doing something on Easter Day, but he's going to give a little sermon at evensong, at evening prayer, on the Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday during Holy Week, and those will be live streamed on Facebook as well for people around the diocese who want to see the bishop doing something during Holy Week. Okay? And of course you can do something really weird and come to church, hear it live, experience it live. Okay, so we're going to talk about the Gospel of Luke. What I've got up on the screen is actually one of the papyrus number 75. This is an interesting one, for people like me at least, because it's got the last paragraph of Luke's Gospel and the first couple of paragraphs of John's Gospel on the same page. Okay. So although this is the entire papyrus, what it shows us is at one stage, this papyrus had the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of John. There must have been people who wanted that combination. Remember, in the very early days, 1st, 2nd, 3rd century, there was no such thing as a Bible inside a cover, as a codex or a book. You had to buy the individual scrolls, basically. And so here's one market niche. There were people who wanted to read Luke and John. That's enough. They didn't need Matthew, didn't need Mark. Luke and John was just good for them. So up the top is the last bit of Luke, and this bit here actually says in Greek, Evangelion kata Luca, the Gospel according to Luke. So it's just it's like a heading, but it's at the bottom of the book, end of the book. And oddly enough, it's also got a heading for John at the beginning, so it's got a double header. And here it's got Evangelion, which is the Greek word for gospel. Evangelion kata Johannem, kata Johannine, which means, of course, the Gospel according to John. So it all looks Greek to you, and that's because it is Greek. Okay? It's supposed to look like Greek. Okay. So we're doing this because we have what's called a 3-year lectionary cycle. And lectionary is just a set of readings. These days they exist in 2 forms. The book that most people think of as the lectionary, if they go to the cathedral bookshop, is a little thin book that has just the readings, a list of the readings for every day of the year for the current year. Plus what, $13 or $15 or something. Okay. But a lectionary in the old sense of the word means a book of Bible readings with just the bits needed for that particular service for the whole year or whatever. So that big red book that you read from, if you're the first reader or the second reader, you go up to the lectern. There's that word again, lect, which of course means to read, to speak, but to read. So the lectern is where you read, and the lectionary is what you read. And so that big red book with all the readings, first reading Psalm, second reading, gospel reading, that's a lectionary. In fact, lectionaries are so common that we have about 10,000 copies of the Greek manuscripts, ancient copies of the Greek manuscripts, which is staggering, really. More than 5,000 of them are lectionaries, not Bibles. In other words, in the ancient church, what you most needed was a book of readings arranged by Sundays. You didn't want Genesis to Revelation. That wasn't much use to you. You wanted the Bible arranged by liturgical use. It'd be like a hymn book, which was organised not from hymn 1 to hymn 763, but had the hymns for Advent Sunday. Then it had the hymns for Advent too. Now, Robert has such a list, but it's not the Australian hymn book. It's not together in song, because they're arranged by topic, by theme. Okay, so it has it does have a calendar, and it does have I'm not sure it has a lectionary anymore. The old BCP did. It has a calendar. Yeah, but it's not a lectionary in the strict sense.
The set of readings is the same every year.
Oh, it's a 3-year. It used to be the same every year, and in the olden days, prior to 40 years ago, when this all changed, you'd have the collect, epistle, and gospel for the second Sunday after Trinity. Collect, epistle, and gospel, and they were printed in the old prayer book, and they were the same every year. And the crusty old rector, who'd probably just come up to his 40-year anniversary of ordination, he'd pull out the yellow paper, he'd take off the paper clip, and he'd preach it again. It didn't matter because no one was listening last year, and they weren't listening this year either. But basically, you had a 1-year cycle. That was in the prayer book, the Book of Common Prayer. Yeah, and you had the same hymns presumably every year, 1-year cycle.
The deal years ago was to throw people down full up and say that for the first one. Do it again for the second.
That's like marking student essays. Yeah. Same thing. Okay, so as part of the Second Vatican Council and the liturgical renewal that was happening throughout the Western Church at that time, this is early 1960s, one of the things that all the churches agreed on, I say all the churches, not the Baptists and not the raise your hands, wave hands in the air kind of Pentecostals, but the uniting church as it became, the Methodists, Presbyterians, the Anglicans, the Lutherans, the Catholics, and so on. They all agreed that we would have a common set of readings, and we'd have what's called a 3-year cycle. 3 years. So 1 year we'd focus on Matthew. So year A, more or less all the gospel readings come from Matthew. Year B, more or less all the readings come from Mark, except Mark is really short and there's not enough material. Mark doesn't have Christmas, and Mark doesn't really have Easter. So we had to supplement Mark with material from the other Gospels. Year C, we have Luke. Okay, so you've got Matthew, Mark, and Luke being focused on. We pay special attention to Matthew in year A, Mark in year B, Luke in year C. This is year C, so this is a year we spend particularly listening to Luke. And that's actually one of the few long-lasting achievements of the ecumenical movement. It means that what they're listening to at St Mary's this morning, basically the same readings. And if they are following the lectionary of the Uniting Church in Grafton, which they probably don't, they'd have the same readings. Depends how mainstream the Uniting Church is and how evangelical it is. And this means you don't just get the parson's favourite passage week after week. You have the discipline of listening to a lectionary, a set schedule of readings. It takes you to different parts of the Bible. And even when I grew up in the Churches of Christ, we had a Church of Christ calendar, which would hang on the wall. It had suggested readings for each Sunday. Guess where they come from? The Roman Catholic Common Lectionary. Just don't tell the people in the Lismore Church of Christ that. Okay, they would be scandalised to think that the Catholics were telling them what to read in church on Sunday. So there's a thing called the Common Lectionary, shared lectionary. Basically, almost entirely copies the Catholic lectionary, and then a few years later, 20 or so years later, they introduce a revised common lectionary which deals with the Old Testament slightly differently. That's not our topic today. So we're going to focus on the 3-year Gospels. G'day. And in particular, we're looking at the Gospel of Luke. So as I said, the 3-year lectionary is one of the treasures of the modern ecumenical movement. It's the one thing we've got right, and we've kept doing it, and it's sticky, which is great. Yes, John? John. Yes, you noticed. That's good. Who said Catholics don't know their Bible? Okay, yes. So it's a 3-year cycle of the synoptics, Matthew, Mark and Luke. Okay. What about John? Ta-da. He tends to get a run. It tends to get a run in Lent and in Easter. And in particular, when we have a whole series of Sundays going through John chapter 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, which are the sort of what's called the Last Supper discourses. So there's quite a lot of material in 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, and that tends to get used a lot during, particularly before Easter, but also just before Pentecost at the end of Easter. And there's another chunk of John chapter 6, which is like this long, has something like 70 verses in it. And in the year of Mark, we have a period in about September where we take a little detour into John's Gospel. And for 6 weeks in a row, the priest has to try and say something about the bread of heaven that they didn't say the week before. Okay, because it's just the same thing week after week after week for about 5 or 6 weeks. That's where John gets in. So John gets a Guernsey, but that's an interesting choice. What they've actually said there is that we're going to privilege Matthew, Mark and Luke because they kind of tell the story of Jesus in a way that's different from John. So they're sort of more or less saying the same story in more or less the same way with a few differences. So that's become like that's the core diet for the Sunday worshippers' gospel food consumption, as it were. Okay? All right. So this year, as we said, we're spending time with Luke. None of you probably look anything like these icons, by the way, but I've just put them up there as illustrations. Okay, so as soon as you set down with the task of, okay, we've got 52 Sundays to work with here, and we've got 24 chapters in Luke. How are we going to go? Well, you're going to try and pick some of them because of what's happening. Like you want the Christmas readings around Christmas time, not in August. Okay? And you want the stories about Holy Week and Easter to pop up around Holy Week and Easter. And then the rest of the ones we sort of fill in all the gaps, which is what you'll see happening really, particularly from next week. Basically the last couple of weeks we've been doing that with Luke's Gospel. So, despite that, there's a whole lot of material from Luke which we will not read out in church this year, even though it's the year of Luke. Okay? Because you don't want to sit there that long. Okay? All right. So, interestingly, we'll come back to this paragraph later, the prologue to Luke's Gospel never gets read in church on a Sunday, which is actually Luke saying what he's doing and why he's doing it. Never hear it in church. Okay? You might hear it in evening prayer or morning prayer, but you're not going to hear it in church on Sunday. There's stories about the conception of John the Baptist and the angel that talks to Zechariah. Gone. Not going to do that. Now it's only found, this first sheet here, is material that only exists in Luke's Gospel. So you think it might be a high priority pick in the year of Luke. It's gone. You'll never hear that in church on Sunday morning. These are just 2 tiny little verses, but they also get left out. They're about John the Baptist. The genealogy of Jesus, mercifully, is omitted from this here. So-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so. Great. We really don't want to listen to that because we're Westerners and we don't have time for that sort of stuff. Okay? Culture. Even the lectionary committee, especially the lectionary committee, has its own culture. There's a lovely little passage which some scholars call the Johannine Thunderbolt. Luke chapter 10, 21 to 24, It sounds like a paragraph that should be in John's Gospel. It's about the Son, and the Son knows what the Father has revealed to him. And Jesus never talks like that in Matthew, Mark and Luke, but he always talks like that in John. So this little paragraph, which kind of doesn't sound very Lucan, gets left out of the lectionary. So it won't bother you. Okay, you won't hear it. Sadly, bad choice of words, the beautiful scene where Jesus weeps over Jerusalem as he comes over the Mount of Olives, that's not going to be read this year either. It gets left out. And it only occurs in Luke. It doesn't occur in Matthew or Mark or John. And for those of us that have been to Jerusalem and have been into the beautiful little church called Dominus Flevit, our Lord wept, which is halfway down the Mount of Olives, a teardrop-shaped church overlooking the Golden Dome. Beautiful little place. It won't show up in this year's readings, so don't hold your breath. Okay, so that's material which is unique to Luke, but is not going to be heard in church during the year of Luke. Then there's material which is what Jesus is doing stuff, healing, performing miracles, whatever, and because it's paralleled in Matthew and Mark, we don't get that this year, because we will have heard it last year or the year before. But that's actually a problem. If we don't hear it this year, we don't realise that's part of Luke's way of talking about Jesus. Okay? So if we only look at the things that are uniquely Luke, we're getting a distorted version of Luke's Gospel. Anyway, so all the adventures of this is at the end of what would have been today's Gospel reading, when the locals in Nazareth tried to throw him off the cliff. Not surprisingly, Jesus decamps and goes down to goes down to Capernaum. We don't get that story this year, but we do get it, of course, in Matthew and Mark. Jesus healing the leper and the paralysed man and calling Matthew or Levi, we won't get that. The first part of chapter 6, more healings, choosing the 12, we won't get that this year. We won't get Jesus stilling the storm. We won't get the healing of Jairus' daughter, the woman that's had a hemorrhage for 30-odd years. We won't get the 12 being sent out on mission, and we won't get the feeding of the 5,000 this year. Okay? We won't get Jesus entering Jerusalem and chasing out the money changers. That gets left out of Luke as well. Okay? Because it gets covered in Matthew and Mark time. Oh, and there's a little summary of his Holy Week activity in Luke chapter 21, just a couple of verses. That gets left out as well. Then there's the teaching of Jesus, and Luke is very big on the teaching of Jesus, but we're going to skip a whole lot of Luke's kind of account of Jesus' teaching. Section about why use parables and the parable of the sower and so on, and the one who already has is going to be given more and so on. That's going to be missing, so a fair bit of chapter 8 is missing. Just a little sort of one sentence about no one lights a light and puts it under a bushel. We're not going to have that because we have it in year A with Matthew. The parable of the mustard seed and the parable of the leaven, gone. Not doing that this year. Okay, the parable of the wedding feast. I can read it. The parable of the wedding feast. That's not going to be heard this year. The proverbs about salt and what to do with salt if it stops being salty. Not that salt can ever stop being salty. That gets left out as well. Parables about Jesus welcoming children, the rich young ruler, the cost of discipleship, and the healing of the blind man in Jericho, all lying on the floor after the editor has been through. The parable about the absent ruler who goes off to a foreign country and leaves his servants with various amounts of money, and what happens when he comes back, that's gone. The saying about give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, interestingly, well, it's in Luke, but it doesn't make the cut because we pick it up in Matthew or Luke time, in Matthew or Mark time. Then there's a whole lot of controversies or arguments Jesus gets involved with, and this is much smaller. I'm sorry, I guess I could have changed it to 2 screens. I'll just quickly go through it. Disputes with the disciples of John, especially about Sabbath. So end of chapter 5, beginning of chapter 6. Conversations, arguments between Jesus and John the Baptist. Are you really the Messiah? Well, what do you reckon? I'm not going to hear that in church this Sunday. Jesus' true family. I'm not going to hear that passage. That's the last part of chapter 8. judgment coming on those who are ashamed of Jesus, prediction of betrayal and the disciples wanting the best seat in the next world, a whole lot of material where Jesus is in argument with the Pharisees, which is what we get in Matthew 23 and so on. Don't be anxious about worldly things. Don't worry about what to say when they drag you into court. Conflicts with Pharisees, banning divorce, warning against sin and so on. Teaching about the end time, disputes with the leaders in the temple about his authority, and then more disputes, including the little story of the widow who puts in her 2 copper coins. Okay? All of those things are going to be missing from our Sunday morning experience of Luke this year. And then finally, almost finally, the saying about when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then you know the end is near, and the enemies of Jesus beginning to plot against him, the deal with Judas Iscariot, the arrangements for the Last Supper, all of that will be left out this year. Okay, so there's a fair bit of Luke you are not going to hear in church this year. Now, part of that is because there are only 52 Sundays. Okay? But it does mean there's a fair bit of Luke we won't be encountering. So obviously choices are necessary, but when we omit so much material, we're actually only going to hear like an edited version, like we're getting the Reader's Digest version of the Gospel of Luke in church every year C. We're not getting the whole unabridged, unexpurgated Gospel of Luke. Okay? We're just going to get selections, and that's means we're not really going to hear the whole of Luke. So it poses me the question, has the lectionary committee kind of domesticated Luke? We'll only let Luke have so much voice. Don't want him to have too much influence on the way people think what's going on here. And of course it raises the question about, so what are we going to do about that? Well, the obvious answer is, at some point fairly early this year, find a couple of hours and just sit down and read Luke from chapter 1 to 24 for yourself. Because we only ever hear it in sound bites anyway. So it's a really good exercise just to sit down, whether it's Mark's Gospel or Luke, because it's the year of Luke, and just read Luke through like you would just a regular novel. Just read it right through. Think about who are the characters, what's happening here, what's the plot, what's the story. And is this different from what I heard, what I remembered from Sunday school? Like as early as the infancy stories, there's no wise men. There's no Herod killing all the babies in Bethlehem. Luke has a different story of Christmas. And we'll only pick that up if we read Luke just basically straight through as a piece of literature. So keep that in mind as a strategy you might want to do at some stage. Would it be fun if we had the right people and people willing to be an audience to have a really good orator perform the Gospel of Luke as just a piece of public reading? So we actually heard it the way it was meant to, because it was not meant to be that everybody had a copy of Luke on their lap. Okay, it was meant to be that you would hear Luke being performed from start to finish, like a show. And we've chopped it up into little serves for 52 Sundays and left a whole lot of scraps on the floor as well. Okay, so year of Luke. So this is a comment that comes from a scholar whose name will pop up in a moment. He makes this interesting observation about really coming to grips with the Gospels. In order to enter more deeply into the reading of the Gospel, one needs to, firstly, consider its place among the other Gospels, recognise its distinctive structure, secondly, and thirdly, become sensitive to its particular way of talking about Jesus. Matthew, Mark and Luke and John each have their own way of talking about Jesus, and the fancy word for that is Christology. But they each have a way of describing Jesus. Okay? So that's what we're going to try and do very briefly in the next few minutes. Oh, and pay some attention to its leading themes. We could be here a long time. Okay, so let's start out by taking the first one. Let's think about Luke amongst the other Gospels. And just very, very briefly, on, I want us to look at things like, so what's our oldest copy of Luke, and how does it compare with the other Gospels? Now look at the content of the Gospels, and then how it got to be written. Now, some of this we've done before in other sessions. I'm just going to skim over it fairly briefly just to remind us of things. So when do we first find copies? I said before we have 10,000 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. So what are the oldest ones that actually have Luke amongst them? Because not everyone, of course, has Luke. So here's one list of the manuscript data for the early Gospels. So interestingly, the oldest fragment we have is a tiny little piece of papyrus called Papyrus 52, and it's a fragment. It's about the size of a large postage stamp, and it's got a little bit of John's Gospel on it, on each side, so we know exactly where it comes from. So the first time Luke is going to turn up, it's going to be right down the bottom of the screen. About the middle of the 3rd century, we have this very important document, P45, which has all 4 Gospels and the book of Acts. But until then, we have no evidence that Luke existed. Interesting. John's there from early on. And we've got copies of the Gospel of Peter and the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of John again, fragments of the Gospel of Matthew. But until we get to the Chester Beatty papyrus or manuscripts, that's our earliest copy of Luke. Okay. Now there are other people quoting from it in the 2nd century and early 3rd century, but we don't have a copy of it until the middle of the 3rd century. And P69 I'll come back to later, this one right at the bottom. It's usually seen as a piece of Luke. I'm going to suggest it's actually something else we'll talk about later. We push on, again, in the middle of the 3rd century, so that's, again, 250 thereabouts. Well, that's the same one, that's the Chester Beatty. But here I'm looking for larger codexes. And we have Codex 69, Papyrus 69 I just mentioned. We'll come back to this one. It's the one we started at the beginning, and it has both Luke and John in it. So we won't worry about this data, but just very briefly, in terms of copies of individual Gospels, John was much, from the evidence we have, which is mostly in Egypt, because the air is dry and the manuscripts don't rot. So there's some variables here. But from the manuscripts that have survived, we have 16 copies which are just John and nothing else. We have 14 copies that are Matthew and nothing else. We have 10 copies that are just Acts. We have 7 copies that are Luke, and only 1 manuscript which only has Mark on it. In other words, Mark was not as popular in Egypt as John and Matthew and so on. So certainly we know the book was around and people were reading it. And I've mentioned this before, that Luke and John, we have a couple of examples of Luke and John. That was a combination people knew about. Same thing again, we're back to our P45, Chester Beatty, around about 250, thereabouts, sometime in the 3rd century, of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and the book of Acts. So that's our first hard evidence for the content of Luke's Gospel. It's one thing to have people quoting from it and saying, oh, this is in Luke's Gospel, but until you see a copy of Luke's Gospel, how do you know that they're accurately reflecting it? So, it's pretty clear that from at least the middle of the 3rd century, Luke is well attested, we know it exists, but it's not as popular as John or Matthew. People, at least in Egypt, preferred to read Matthew and John than to read Luke. But it's way more popular than Mark, and that would have made Luke very happy. Well, he tells us at the beginning of his book that other people have had a crack at this, but I'm going to do it properly now and show you how it should be said. So he'll be delighted that people weren't interested in Mark and that, he's getting all the positive reviews. So that's physical evidence for the physical book actually existing. The next category is just in terms of the story. When we put Matthew, Mark and Luke side by side, they pretty much tell the same. Mark doesn't have the Sermon on the Mount, but Matthew and Luke do, except for Luke, it's not on a mountain. Okay, but notice down here, Luke from end of chapter 9 to well into chapter 19, that's 10 chapters out of 24. Luke has Jesus travelling to Jerusalem. You don't get that in Matthew. You don't get that in Mark. You don't get it in John. In John, he goes backwards and forwards all the time to Jerusalem. So Luke has arranged his story. It's more or less the same story, but Matthew does it in less than, say, 1.5 chapters. Mark does it in 1 chapter. Luke spins it out so that the central part of his gospel is Jesus having adventures while he's on the way to Jerusalem, from which he will never come home. Okay? He's not going to go there backward and forwards, except as a kid. We don't need to worry too much about this data. Just quickly, you can see that Matthew at 1,068 verses, Luke at 1,098 verses, Mark at 661. Yeah, there's a difference, significant difference in length. And basically, and that's particularly here in the sayings, not a huge difference in the number of scenes, but notice this. Mark has hardly any teaching material. Matthew and Luke both have a lot of teaching material, some of which we will hear this year. We don't need to worry about that, it's too much detail for us. The other thing is, again, no surprise, 77 sayings which we find in Matthew and Luke are omitted by Mark, and that just explains the difference. Otherwise, much the same data. Okay. So scholars talk about the material that's only found in Matthew, we call Matthean material. Okay. Stuff that's only found in Luke, we call Lucan material, or Lucan special material. Material that's common between Matthew and Luke, but not found in not found in Mark, is sometimes called the double tradition, or Q, from the German word Quelle, meaning source. Okay. So when we look at the Gospels, 2 at a time, we find there's a lot of agreement, particularly between Matthew and Mark, and between Luke and Mark, but very little agreement between Matthew and Luke. So that's going to make the 3-year cycle potentially interesting. The only place where Matthew and Luke agree with each other is when they're copying Mark word for word. Were they students handing in an essay for me to Mark, they would be reported for academic misconduct. Okay? Different culture. In their world, that wasn't misconduct. So Mark is pivotal, but Luke has a particular focus, which I'm going to come up shortly. So when we look at style, Mark is pretty rough. It's the worst Greek in the New Testament. Matthew has tried to improve it, and Luke has the best Greek. It's still not the best Greek in the ancient world, but Luke is the most educated of any of the Gospel writers. His Greek is slightly better, and he has slightly fancier vocabulary. All right? So that's one of the things we'll notice about Luke. And yet, when we find both Luke and Matthew have the same passage and they share it with Mark, 9 times out of 10, Luke agrees with Mark's wording where Matthew tries to improve it. So it's got a different way of going about using their sources. Okay. What Luke tends to do is to play with the transitions. He doesn't mess with Mark, but he reframes Mark in the way he gets from one thing to the next, so it feels more sophisticated. He loves little summaries. So Luke is one of several early Christian Gospels. In fact, there were like 30, not just the 4 of the New Testament. He has a very close literary relationship with both Mark and Matthew. He's telling a story. That's the kind of genre that he's dealing with. And the other thing about Luke, which we won't really see in this year, Luke is the only Gospel who doesn't stop at Easter. It goes on into the Acts of the Apostles. So the Gospel of Luke is part 1 of a 2-volume document. So that means Luke has a bigger frame of reference, which we won't really glimpse all that easily when we listen to the Sunday readings. So things like, for example, and the readings we've had the last two, particularly last Sunday, when Jesus goes to he's starting his public ministry, as Luke tells the story. He goes to the synagogue, he reads from the lectionary that they were using, and then he gives a speech, and the speech is about the Holy Spirit coming on him. In the book of Acts, at the beginning of the Christian mission, Peter stands up and gives a speech. It's a speech about the Holy Spirit coming on the disciples. You sort of see how Luke is shaping the story so that there are parallels between the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles. Like the Gospel of John, which has a little statement of purpose at its end, which is this one. Now, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written so you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. So John actually tells us why they've pulled this stuff together. Luke does a similar thing, and we'll see that when we come to the preface, where he actually says what he's doing and why he's doing it. The third thing I want to cover just very briefly is to address the question, how did Luke get written? Mark's already there, Matthew's probably already there, John's Gospel's sort of over on the side, developing on its own kind of trajectory. How did we get the Gospel of Luke? So the most popular explanation amongst biblical scholars is this one, that there was a very early collection of sayings and activities which we call the Q Gospel or the Q source. Round about 75, Mark partly draws on that, but also writes a story that's more about action. The Q document is more about sayings, and Mark writes a story about stuff Jesus did, not so much things that he said. A bit later on, Matthew decides that he wants to supplement Mark, put out, if you like, in our terms, a new and revised edition of the Gospel, where he'll add some of the stuff that was missing. So he particularly draws on the Q Gospel, but he also adds the birth stories, and he does a much better job of the resurrection stories than what we find in Mark. And then, according to this popular theory, later on, Luke comes along, and he's also drawing on Mark, but he's independent of Matthew, which is why he tends not to agree with Matthew word for word. And Luke has also drawn on the Q Gospel as well as Mark, more or less around the same time as Matthew, perhaps a decade or so later. And the dates are really tricky to assign because we don't have the original copies and they don't come with printing dates. You've got to kind of line things up. Well, Matthew seems to come after Mark, and Mark seems to be after this, and Matthew seems to be before that, so you kind of arrange them in a sequence.
What are the Q Gospels?
It's the simple explanation is it's the material found in Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark. But people think it existed as a separate document from very early times. Okay, and it's called Q simply because that's the German word for Quelle, meaning source. It could be called X, it could be called anything, but in the 19th century, some German scholars said, let's call this, we've got this Quelle, this source, so they just called it Q. M for Matthew, L for Luke, Q for this source. So, yeah.
When they were written, was the same geographic area?
All good questions. Partly we don't know, but we don't admit that. Of course, biblical scholars don't want to admit our ignorance. So, because we're at a stage where it was even up to the end of the first century, people were more invested in the oral tradition than in the written tradition. So these books went on to have a lot more authority at a later stage than they had originally. So we don't get told who wrote, like Matthew, Mark and Luke and John are in fact anonymous. We say it's written by Matthew. Matthew just means the guy who wrote Matthew's Gospel. Okay, it's not the Matthew among the 12 disciples. Now, of course, they tried to give these books prestige by linking them with Matthew or with John. Or in the case of Mark and Luke, interestingly, they're linked to associates of Paul who were not part of the 12. But being a friend of Paul is still pretty good on your CV in terms of status. Okay, so we don't know who wrote them. They do appear to be community documents which have evolved over time and have different layers in them. Okay, now we know that that happened in the past because in the case of the Dead Sea Scrolls of Qumran, we have numerous copies of the Psalter, and most of them only go to as far as about Psalm 109. Well, they go to 151, 152, but they're the same as our Psalter up until 109. So we know that that far in the Psalter was agreed on by the first century, but the rest of the Psalms kind of tumbled into the folder as time went by. So they're sort of layer upon layer. As to where they're written, again, they're looking for clues. Like Mark uses a word in chapter 2 where he talks about the healing of the paralysed man. Remember, they make a hole in the roof, they let him down. And Luke uses a word for a tile. Now, there were no tiled houses in Palestine, but there were tiled houses in Rome. Ding! Mark must have been written in Rome. Well, that's a bit of a long shot. He might have just picked up a fancy word for roof material. But that means Mark gets assigned to Rome. Matthew is almost certainly coming out of what today we would call southern Turkey, Antioch, the area around Antioch, which used to be Syria, but these days it's part of the southern bump of Turkey. That's probably where Matthew comes from, which would suggest that Mark probably comes from there as well, since Matthew is just doing an update on Mark's Gospel. Luke, very hard to place, but it is much more oriented on the Roman Empire, much less provincial. It likes rich people and wealthy people and people of power and substance and big institutions. So it could be anywhere in the eastern half of the Mediterranean, but probably a large Greek city in the Roman Empire. And John, again, there's nothing in the Gospel of John which would tell us where it was written. Some people think it was written even, they'll say, on the eastern bank of the Jordan River. Other people say it was written in Ephesus and so on. So there's no fixed place, because that sort of data is really hard to fix. It's really, you're looking for hints in the text, and then you're trying to develop an explanation based on that. Yep. This is good. I get to drink the coffee.
Can I ask you a very astute question?
Go for it.
Does it mean that when we read Mark, it wasn't Mark who wrote that?
Correct. Just like Homer didn't write the Odyssey and so on. Yeah.
Doesn't that mean that reading loses its authority?
Well, no. Mark was not one. In fact, Luke and Mark, neither of them, were part of the group of people travelling around with Jesus. So even if we think Mark, also called John Mark, who does appear in the Acts of the Apostles and in some of Paul's letters, so he's a colleague of Paul and in the very early days. He was not one of the people who was travelling with the disciples at the beginning. So he's obviously relying on other people. He's collecting. And Easter happens round about 30, April the year 30. This is not being written to about 45 years later. And most people in the Roman Empire didn't live more than 40 years because of health and illness and danger on the roads, etc. Childbirth in the case of women. So if Mark is written, as most people think, after the Romans destroyed the city of Jerusalem in 70 AD, then for that person to have been an eyewitness of Jesus is virtually impossible. Let alone, in the tradition, John's Gospel is written by the disciple John, who's a very old man at the end of the century. Well, no, he'd he'd be well over 100 years old. And nobody lived that long in the Roman Empire. Very few people lived that long in Grafton, let alone in the Mediterranean world with Roman soldiers and bandits and disease and bad medicine and all the rest. So these are, that's why I said they're community documents. They're the memory of the community that have been gathered together. So even Mark has used sources, like he's got a whole lot of stories that are linked with Bethsaida. So people talk about a Bethsaida source in Mark's Gospel in chapters 5 and 6. He's got a whole lot of stories that all, the common link is they're all to do with Bethsaida. Or when they're remembering the sayings of Jesus, they tend to remember them, collect them by common words. So if there's a parable about light, there'll be another one about light, and there'll be a third one about light, because knowing one helps you to remember the second one. So this is how they would remember things in the ancient world. And they would pass it on orally for decades. And so whoever created what we call the Gospel of Mark, whoever it was not somebody who was an adult listening to Jesus 50 years earlier. Okay. It's somebody who's a healthy adult doing this project at least in the mid-70s, if not in the mid-80s. Yeah.
So, a vague child being told Luke was a physician, that's why it was much different. So that's all.
No, that's H.J. Cadbury's doctoral thesis from the 1930s, and it's wrong. There's nothing in Luke's. So there is a reference to a Luke who's a physician in one of the what we call the pastoral epistles, which are almost certainly not written by Paul. They're almost certainly second or third generation Pauline developments. So for a start, that doesn't help us. Secondly, there's nothing. Luke's gospel does have slightly fancier vocab, but it's no fancier than anybody else in the ancient Roman world with a similar Greek education. Like I know how to spell anaesthetics. It doesn't mean I'm a doctor. It just means I've been to university. I'm slightly more educated than some of my kids who went through school in Lismore with me. Okay. I am a doctor, but a different sort.
It's like 3 or 4 people sending the story of the history of the Aboriginal people in Australia.
That's a helpful analogy. I don't want to get too sidetracked on this as well, but there you've got a highly literate culture coming in to a non-literate context, not really knowing the language, but trying to document what those other people are thinking and doing and believing. That has its own issues. So it's more like the indigenous people told stories which helped them navigate the landscape, and they could sing the song lines or rehearse the song lines. The followers of Jesus told these stories over and over again, which helped them to work out how to be a Christian. I remember the story Jesus told, about such and such. So that's the origin. So between Jesus and the first gospel, there's at least 40 years of oral tradition. And in that time, almost everybody who knew Jesus has died. There might be 1 or 2 people left. The other thing I'll tell you about Luke is that he was a painter, and that he painted the first icons, and that he painted an icon of the Blessed Virgin Mary, which is all nonsense as well. Okay? That's a lovely tradition. And what happens is, of course, in the Byzantine and the medieval church, church leaders are besotted with making up these kind of traditions. And it's just what they do. And there's a spiritual value to it that is not a historical value. All right, let's try and skip back. I'll skip some of this because it's more detail than I want. I want to skip across to what I think is, I'm going to need to do this, just bear with me for a second. There it is. Keep going. Okay. So I wanted to say a word about Marcion. Marcion was the world's first heretic. How's that for a business card? Marcion of Sinope. Heretic, number 1. Heretic 1.0. He was a wealthy ship owner and a Christian, and he moved to Rome, and he was writing checks to pay for stuff around the church. They loved him, as we do. Wealthy person moves to town, start writing checks. Hey, give them a job. Hang on to them. Don't let them drift away. Give them top pastoral care. Marcion gets into trouble and eventually he's kicked out of the church, and for the next 100 years or so it was a neck and neck race as to whether Catholic Christianity, or what our team called the Marcionite heresy, would be the dominant form of Christianity. Okay? He almost won. If Marcion had won, the Christian church would be very different. But Marcion did one thing that was particularly interesting. He caused us to have the New Testament. And everybody agrees on that, but the question is, how did he do it? What was it that he did that caused us to have the New Testament? So Marcion's big gift is that we now have a New Testament, because up until his time, he's at his prime around about 140. So it's roughly the middle of the 2nd century. He's fallen out with the bishop in Rome, and he's got all these people through Greece and Turkey who think he's the best church leader ever. Okay? And he's got lots of money and he has lots of followers. And in response, the Catholics say, we better organise the gospel, we better organise the New Testament then. Okay, not those exact words, obviously, but in responding to Marcion, that's what happens. So, he's actually a theological conservative. He liked the old prayer book, basically. Okay? And his old prayer book was, hate the Jews, because the Jews killed Jesus. Get rid of the Old Testament. Get rid of any taint of Judaism from Christianity, because Romans don't like Jews. And if we're going to be able to evangelise the Roman Empire, we've got to say Jews in that corner, Christians over here, because we don't want the Roman Empire to think we're just a weird bunch of Jewish rebels. Okay? But all the early fathers, as they're called, people like Irenaeus and others, consider him to be the first and the worst of the heretics. Okay. Now there were some problems with that idea, but to say, well, the angry God of the Old Testament is not the God of Jesus. Lots of Christians have wondered about that. But to throw out the Old Testament and to throw out Matthew's Gospel and so on, and to only have, basically, his hero was Paul, who, as you remember, could have some hard things to say about the law and about Judaism and so on at times. So what's going on here? So he's anti-Jewish and pro-Paul, we said all that. He came up, his churches had a canon, a Bible, which only had 2 bits in it. Didn't have the Old Testament, didn't have the prophets, didn't have the Torah. It had 2 bits. It had a thing called the Evangelion, the Gospel. The Gospel. Not the Gospel according to Marcion or the Gospel according to Matthew. The Gospel. And he had a second part called the Apostle. And only had Paul. No John, no James. Okay? No Peter. Just Paul. Evangelion and Apostolon, the Apostle. Now, the controversy around that led the early Christian leaders to say, but we're not going to throw out Matthew, and we're not going to throw out Mark. And it took them a couple of 100 years, but no, we're not going to throw out John. John only just made it in, and it took hundreds of years for John's Gospel to be accepted, because it was too Gnostic. It's light and darkness and stuff, okay? So what's going on here? The interesting question is, for us today, is how is this different from the Gospel of Luke? Now, what scholars have said for the last 100 years is that Marcion took the Gospel of Luke and he cut out the bits that didn't agree with his theology, and the end result is Evangelion. But a recent study, a doctoral thesis done on Marcion, has argued exactly the opposite. That the bits that are missing from Marcion's Gospel are not the bits that were contrary to his theology. He's kept lots of things, if you believe that's the relationship. The bits that have been added to Luke, or added to the Evangelion to make Luke, are the bits that have gone in to kind of control Marcion and to make Marcion's gospel more acceptable as the Gospel of Luke. Now we begin to make sense of the preface where he says lots of other people, I'm not going to name anybody like Marcion, but lots of other people have had an attempt to tell this story, but now I'm going to give it to you, the official version, an orderly account, so you will understand the truth about which you're being instructed. So just very, very briefly, I've said most of this. The debate comes down to, did Marcion come after Luke, and did he cut out a whole lot of bits of Luke he didn't agree, or did Luke come after Marcion, and Luke, the Gospel of Luke, is an attempt to make Marcion acceptable within the Catholic Church. And as a consequence, it gets a spot alongside Matthew and Mark. And this is, if you're interested, this is the book to look for. I've got a copy if you want to borrow it, from Badun, the First New Testament, Marcion Scriptural Canon. So, don't need to worry about that at this stage. But his conclusion is that Marcion's document actually tells us what the Q document looked like prior to the Lucan edition coming out. Okay? So that, suffice to say, for our purposes, there's the Gospel of Luke, like the Gospel of John, is like a multi-layer cake, and it has material in it from different sources and different time periods, and that's exactly what Luke chapter 1 tells us. Okay? Many other people have tried to present a version of the Gospel before now, and now, Theophilus, I'm giving you an orderly account. This is like the final version. You can ignore all those other versions out there. This is the honky-dory Gospel. Now, Papyrus 69 has always been seen as a kind of a weird version of a particular section of Luke, but now it's regarded as possibly the only manuscript we have coming from Marcion's Evangelion. It's kind of Lucan, but is it pre-Luke or post-Luke is the question. That's the sort of thing that biblical scholars get excited about. Okay. So I'm going to skip all this as well because it's not critical. So that the end result of all this is that I want to at least entertain the possibility that the Gospel of Luke, along with the Book of Acts, instead of being written parallel to Matthew, is written last of the Gospels, but it is based on the Q Gospel. It's based on the U, which we also find in Marcion, but it does know Matthew, and of course it knows Mark. So I think, as Luke tells us in his opening paragraph, I think he's conscious that several other people have already had a crack at this before he came along. These dates are relatively flexible. People get very excited about whether you date Matthew to 85 or 105. That's 20 years, 2,000 years ago. It's not and we don't have any firm dates in any case, so it's not like something to be too stressed over. Okay, finally the preface from Luke. This is how he starts. Since many have undertaken, so this is the very opening line of Luke's Gospel. Since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. So that's a reference to the oral period. At least 40 years, maybe 100 years, when things were handed on, because people knew the stories, and they told the stories, and they rehearsed them in church and so on. So I too decided, after investigating everything carefully from the very first, to write an orderly account for you. So Luke is going to present for Theophilus, whose name's about to come up, he's going to present for Theophilus his ordered account. Now, ordered doesn't necessarily mean historical. Orderly means I have carefully arranged it. I have structured this to make my argument. And you can structure a document. It's like you've got a piece of music and you're going to arrange it in a particular way. And then that arrangement, it's the same tune, but the arrangement nuances, the music. So, most excellent Theophilus, whoever he was, we have no idea. Okay? And part of the problem is that sounds like a title for a Roman official, but Theophilus means lover of God, like the radio show Frank and Ernest. Is it really two guys called Frank and Ernest? We know how that joke goes with Frank and Ernest. So is Theophilus a real person? And there were real people called Theophilus, okay? But his name means lover of God. So this is just like, dear reader, dear genuine searcher, okay, I have the answer for you. Buy this product. So I'm doing this so you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have been instructed. And if Luke, in commas, is writing this on our side of Marcion, that makes more sense. There's a political argument going on, and Luke is writing on the side of the Catholics, and he's opposing the Marcionites. Okay, so there's, Lord help us, would you believe it? There's politics in the church. Really? Even in the 2nd century. Okay? Wait till the 4th century when the emperor becomes a Christian. Wow, then you've really got politics in the church. Okay, so we've talked about how we got Luke, what it's like as a piece of literature. Let's briefly look at its structure. I just want to mention a couple of points. I'm not going to go through it in detail. Firstly, Luke begins with his stories of the parallel births of John the Baptist and Jesus. And we've got 7 episodes, 3 for John, 3 for Jesus, and then a slam dunk at the end, which is Jesus in the temple as a 12-year-old. So we know which of these boys is the hero. But if Luke is writing for a Roman audience in the middle of the 2nd century, think Romulus and Remus. Because there were 2 boys at the founding of the empire. There are 2 boys at the founding of God's empire. And one of them is going to go on to be the emperor, and the other one is going to disappear. Okay, so Luke, again, is writing for a well-educated Roman audience, upper-class audience. Place is really important. Place is not accidental. Luke is very deliberate, both in the Gospel and in the book of Acts, about place. As we've already seen, he spends almost half his book shifting Jesus from Galilee to Jerusalem. Okay? And there's a logic in the book of Luke followed by Acts. The Gospel comes from the Galilee to Jerusalem, and then it goes from Jerusalem to Samaria to the ends of the world. Or Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria to the ends of the world. And where do you end up in the last chapter of the book of Acts? In Rome, where Paul is under house arrest, preaching the gospel in Rome. Okay? And in Luke's gospel, and this is the next point, Jesus and the gospel never goes back to Galilee. There are no Galilee Easter events. Luke, get this, Luke relocates Easter to Jerusalem. That's pretty bold. Okay? None of this stuff about Jesus appearing by the lake and catching fish and cooking breakfast for the boys. No. Never go back. Never go back. On to the next destination. So Luke reschedules Easter. So it only happens in Jerusalem. There are no Galilean Easter appearances. Okay. And of course, Luke goes on with the Acts of the Apostles, where the gospel does go initially to Judea, then it spreads to Samaria, then it goes to the Greeks, as in the Mediterranean world, and finally it ends up in Rome. So one of the things about Luke's structure is his use of place, geography. Another one of the things, just to mention in passing, is his use of songs and texts like the Benedictus and the Magnificat and the Nunc Dimittis, which have become the core musical traditions of the Western, or of the Church, East and West, are only found in Luke's Gospel. So Luke has not only structured this, but he's given us, in the book of Acts, he gives us speeches, which are custom designed for the character and the place. In the Gospel, he gives us songs, which are custom designed for the character and the place. And those songs have become the very epicenter of the church's prayer and musical tradition. Then there's the question of paying attention to Christological emphases. How does Luke talk about Jesus? Okay. Well, firstly, he gives Jesus a special birth, but he also gives John a special birth. And in Luke's gospel, Mary is not a virgin. Okay, we heard even in church this morning, isn't this Joseph's son? Luke chapter 4. Okay, and in chapter 2, his father and his mother were looking for him, and when his father and mother found him, so there's a special birth going on, but the virgin birth's in Matthew. Now, because we read them together, but the people who were reading Luke were not reading Matthew. Okay, so there's a special birth like any emperor would have, remarkable signs, angels popping in and out and so on, but this is not a virgin birth, any more than John the Baptist's birth was a virgin birth. It was a surprising birth, miraculous birth, but it wasn't a virgin birth in the Gospel of Luke. Jesus is portrayed as a Torah-observant Jew. That's not how he's portrayed in the Gospel of John. He does all the right things. He's circumcised on the 8th day. He's brought to the temple on the 40th day in the feast we had on yesterday, presentation. He's back there again as a 12-year-old doing his bar mitzvah and so on. And his followers continue to gather in the temple, as we read in the first chapters of the book of Acts. Okay? So he's somebody who respects tradition, and that goes down really well in Rome. Okay? Luke has an agenda. For Luke, the most powerful description of Jesus is that he's the prophet sent by God. In John, he's the son of the Father. Okay? And in Mark and Matthew, he's the Messiah. But the most important way that Luke talks about Jesus is he's the prophet sent by God. He's also the innocent victim of state violence who dies a noble death. In Luke's gospel, when we get to the crucifixion, Jesus is very dignified. He never loses his cool. He doesn't say, my God, why have you let this happen to me? He's just in cool, talking to the other two guys next to him, making arrangements for what's going to happen later in the day. And he dies a noble Roman death. He's almost stoic. So who is Luke writing for? He's not describing, he's representing Jesus for his audience. I just said that. And of course, it's Luke who has Jesus stay around Jerusalem for another, is that number again, 40 days, whereas in Matthew he disappears and reappears on a mountain in Galilee, but you never see him again. And in John, he's hanging around, he's coming up to the lake, he's cooking fish, he's coming in out of locked doors, and doing various things, but he's gone, even the first day, he's gone back to heaven. Luke has Jesus around for 40 days, which of course is a biblical number, and then you get the ascension, and that's it, Jesus is no longer here. So that again is a very definite and a very definite way of structuring the gospel. But what happens to dead Roman emperors? They ascend into heaven and they become a son of God. Okay? So Luke is portraying Jesus as having a trajectory like any well-placed Roman would expect the Son of God to have. He's going to leave this place at the right time. He's going to ascend up to heaven, and he's going to be glorified and recognised as one of the gods, which in Christian terms means Son of God. Okay, we're almost there. About 2 minutes left. So the last thing was its leading themes. So one of the themes running through Luke, but also Acts, is the relationship of Christianity to Judaism. And as we see, as you go through, particularly it becomes clearer in the book of Acts. But the relationship to the temple, the relationship to the festivals, and the relationship to the scriptures are very important in the way Luke tells the story. He's also, I suspect, he's appealing for Roman tolerance, so he's offering a kind of apologia for second century Christianity. He's appealing to the Romans, don't treat us badly. We're not like those Jews. We're different from the Jews. In fact, when you get into the book of Acts, every time there's trouble in the book of Acts, guess who's causing it? The Jews. Okay, and Paul is like, oh, I didn't mean to start any problems. I'm just doing my thing. Okay, but it's the Jews and sometimes the mob stirred up by the Jews. What do the Romans hate? The mob. And they've had a problem for the last 70 years with the Jews. 3 times they've had to go to Judea and flatten them. And where did they raise their army? In Turkey. And where was Christianity most numerous? In Turkey. So where is it most, and where did Marcion come from? Turkey. Okay. Where is it most essential for Greek-speaking Christians to say, please don't confuse us with the Jews? Turkey. Okay. So this might give us a clue as to where, sorry, you asked where Luke was written. He seems to be speaking to the concerns of the most populous Christian community, which is what we call Turkey, what they called Asia, which was the eastern part of the Greek world, of course, in those days. Another theme through the book of Luke is, of course, the role of the Spirit from John the Baptist and Jesus and Mary and so on all the way through, of course, continuing on through the Acts of the Apostles. And Luke is also interested in people other than fishermen. Fishermen were not very cool in the Roman pecking order. And there are lots of other characters in Luke's story, including wealthy women, some of whom had husbands in the Herodian administration, and of course householders like Mary and Martha and Lazarus in Bethany on the Mount of Olives. So he has a slightly more mixed cast of characters around Jesus. I think that's just wrapping up. So as I've been suggesting, Luke is consciously building on earlier Gospels, but he's also got a need to provide the Christian convert with clear instruction because there are other points of view around, like Marcion. And he wants to kind of wean them off any attraction to Marcion. He doesn't want them to become so anti-Jewish that they throw out the Bible. So Jesus does all the right things in the opening chapters. It's just like an excerpt from the book of Samuel. He wants to offer an orderly account, a structured account, and of course he takes the story way beyond Easter and right down to somewhere in the late 60s, leading up to the death of Paul. As I've suggested, he's really in some ways, he's offering a Christian apologia, a document designed to say to the Roman government, we're okay, we're not going to be a threat. Obviously we are. If we follow Jesus, we're going to turn the empire upside down. But that's not what Luke is saying. Luke is saying, don't be scared. We're not going to take over the world. We're not going to change anything. He's lying, but you can see what he's doing. Okay. So I would suggest that he's the last of the synoptic Gospels, rather than being at the same time as Matthew. I think he's also read Matthew, and I think he's probably the last of the canonical Gospels. But the Gospel of Luke has roots that go right back to the very earliest Christian days with the Q Gospel. But it's also dealing with the realities in the middle of the 2nd century. Okay, we better stop there because we've done our hour and a bit for those who were here when we started early. But I hope that gives you some food for thought, and that as we go through the year and we hear reading after reading from Luke's Gospel, you will be able to put it into a framework. Oh, that's where this fits in. This is part of Luke's way of dealing with stuff. And you might even be inspired to go home this afternoon and sit down for a couple of hours and, near an aircon and just read Luke's Gospel from chapter 1 to 24. It's a well-written story, but it's a very different story from Matthew and Mark. So I hope you enjoy it. Yes, Alan?
Is our lecture of the Bible matched to the publications of the readings and sometimes the lecture Bible is different to the readings.
Okay, yeah. The Australian Anglican Church has its own version of the Revised Common Lectionary. And the Australian Liturgical Committee, for whatever reason, in their wisdom, decided to tweak a couple of passages here and there. But we're not a big enough church to print our own lectionary book. So we tend, if we have a lectionary book, we either have a Roman Catholic one or a Church of England one. And like this week, in the big red book, if you had really sharp eyes, you would have noticed I had a bit of paper stuck there with a paper clip because they didn't have our reading, because that's a Church of England book and they don't do that text on this Sunday. So 9 times out of 10 it's fine. Similarly, if you compare which you won't ever want to do, but were you to compare the lectionary of the Episcopal Church in the US with the Church of England, with New Zealand, with Australia, with the Catholics, 9 times out of 10 it's the same, but every now and then they just decide to read a few verses differently. Yeah. Yes?
Just from my perspective, it's particular for those two.
You're welcome. Yeah, no, you're very welcome. I don't pretend to have all the answers, but I have fun asking the questions. Yeah.
It's just maybe a difficult question. Is there any way that you can meaningfully talk about the Jews' history, given what you presented? Is it possible to still exactly?
That's my other life. Yes, it is.
Or is it,
Yeah.
Is this best for the Jews' history, like Schweitzer said, impossible?
Yeah. Schweitzer was making a point, but his point is slightly overcooked. Yes, we can, but the core question is what's going to count as data? Okay, so for some people, we just read the Gospels, that's it, take it at face value, try and harmonise them as best we can, that's the historical Jesus. Other people like myself are going to be looking at it from a range of perspectives, including what do we know about Jewish life in Galilee in the late 20s and early 30s of the first century? What do we know about Nazareth? I'm actually involved with the excavations in Nazareth and at Bethsaida, hence the joke before. So what do we know about Galilee in the time of Herod Antipas? What was possible? What was normal? What do we know about the Herodian power structure and how that intersected with Rome, etc., etc., etc.? So when you boil all that down, it is possible to, I think, to talk sensibly about the historical Jesus. But he won't be exactly the same as Jesus in Luke, because Luke is taking what he knows about Jesus and addressing it to his audience, his imagined audience at least. But no, I certainly don't agree with ultra-skeptics who say we don't know anything about Jesus. We know more about Jesus than we know about Julius Caesar. But nobody says, was Julius Caesar a real person? But we've got a lot more data for Jesus. But he wasn't an emperor, so he didn't put up monuments. Okay, so we're looking for different sort of data because he didn't build an empire. He didn't have an army. He didn't conquer. Well, he did conquer, but it took 300 years, and then the Roman Empire became sort of Christian. Yeah. So it's really a really good question. But that's actually what I've spent the last 30 years working on. So don't press the go button. Some other time. Okay. All right, let's call it quits. And as I said, in a month's time, we'll have John Shearer here, and he'll be doing a session on mindfulness for Christians as we begin to get into Lent. And then on the first Sunday in April, I'll do a session on making the most of Holy Week and Easter. Okay. See you all later.